everybody. Welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. You've got me and Nate and special guest Nick. Nick, I am not even going to try to mangle your last name.
It's all good. It's Babakitis. So now that we got that,
Babakitis. All right, I'm still now that I know how to say it. I'm just going to call you Nick because my American ass cannot say that last name.
It's all good.
Now, Nick, introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are.
I'm Nick. I currently live in Berlin. I am from the lovely podcast Corner Späti. In case anyone's heard that, probably not.
Nick, because we saw some great content floating around the internet about Berlin and rent control and socialism in Venezuela, I wanted to bring you on because you know a lot about the situation with being a renter in Berlin. And so we put together basically a program to talk about a couple of things. And I guess I wanted to start out with a kind of an introduction on the topic here, because as we all know from terrible boomer memes, the military fights socialism and all veterans hate socialism really badly, although they are extremely horny for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I bring that up because never mind the fact that your average day in the U.S. military feels like America if the Soviets had won. It's just everything's controlled. There's posters everywhere exhorting you to live up to the Army values. The buildings look like shit, but there are a bunch of things about it that are hilarious in that regard because there's these contradictions that come up. And so never mind the fact that unlike any job that I know of, besides being like a top tier asshole in the tech industry, the military guarantees you and your family housing either for free, like in government housing, in military housing on base, or a cost of living adjusted tax-free allowance. So cash on top of your salary. And that's obviously in addition to like the guaranteed free healthcare for you and your family in the military. And as an example, I went through and used the basic allowance for housing calculator because the numbers change every year, and so they get updated with like inflation. If you're married and you're a sergeant in the Army, so E5 pay grade, and you're stationed in Fayetteville, North Carolina, you would be getting, if you lived off base, you would be getting an additional $1,212 tax-free to cover your housing on top of your salary. And it comes in with your paycheck, and if your housing is less, it costs less than that, you just keep the difference. So it's not like controlled as like a voucher. It's legitimately, you get to keep the difference. You can also opt to live on base, and they have family housing that would be free. And it changes based on where you're stationed, based on the cost of living. So in Anchorage, Alaska, that's where I was stationed when I was in the Army, it's for that same rank and also being married, it would be $2,028. And in New York City, I'm not making this up, I promise, it's $3,366 tax-free for housing. Now, fuck landlords and fuck the Army. We're not a pro-military podcast at all, but I wanted to bring this up because talking about landlordism and like the excesses of landlordism in the way our economy works, you notice that the military is like, wow, we really want to insulate our service members from that and not have, some people who get stationed in like Honolulu or like recruiters in New York have to pay 95% of their income in rent. So we're just going to give them cost of living adjusted tax-free housing allowances or free housing. And so boomers know this to be true, that all veterans hate socialism and the military is opposed to socialism, and yet somehow this is happening. And I feel like the story of this past decade, obviously like the story of our whole fucking lives, but certainly this past decade, is that in advanced economies, disgusting, just like rapacious landlordism has been getting worse and worse, and with basically completely supine governments not trying to do anything to combat it. And so, Nick, you're a host on Corner Späti. You live in Berlin. You've experienced both the good and the bad of living in a country that at least seems to want to marginally work with rent control. So I'm wondering, how's it going and how's the rent?
Well, rent sucks regardless, but at least I can say that I'm lucky that I don't pay. To keep in mind that like I'm currently a student and I still make about like 850 euros a month. Like, because Berlin's really weird. Germany's really weird that like students are only allowed to like work 20 hours a week, which is good because then you get to like focus on your studies. It's not like the US where it's like, oh, hey, yeah, you can try to do a full-time job and do full-time studies and like kill yourself over it while then putting yourself in debt, obviously.
Yeah.
So there are restrictions there, but where I was last living was $366 a month, like with all amenities and stuff like that, in like a really sought after area of Berlin. And I know that in comparison to friends I have in the US who are doing like their masters or the PhDs, who are getting like, studio apartments or whatever. This isn't like Phoenix, so somewhere that's like not even like LA or San Francisco or New York. They're spending like 3 times as much as I am. So I can honestly say that it's good I mean, given I got my apartment 5 years ago. So there was always kind of this idea then that the renter should have more rights than that of the landlord. However, in the last, I would say, couple of years, that's like drastically been changing, especially because the idea of Berlin as a city of what it should be has also been changing. And I know that we're going to get to it probably in a little bit, but Berlin just passed a pretty strict rent control for the next 5 years. That is €7.98, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know the exact number, but still, nonetheless, it keeps rents, obviously, like I calculated what my apartment would be at that. I think it was like 58 meters squared or something like that. And I could afford the whole apartment by myself with having a student job. So
it's incredible. I mean, obviously, I know Berlin's not the most expensive city in Germany, but it's still a major city. It's one of the cheapest
cities in Europe.
Yeah, because I'd read about that like Lisbon and Berlin are some of the cheapest. London's insane. I live in London and it's absurdly expensive. It's not as expensive in pure dollar terms as New York, but the salaries are so much lower here that it winds up being a much bigger percentage of people's incomes. But what was interesting to me was, I'd heard about Berlin having cheap rent. A friend of mine lived in Marburg and then in Berlin in like 06, 07, and he was telling me about his insane cheap rent, where like he was paying less for a flat, like a 2-bedroom flat with his girlfriend in, I want to say Prenzlauer Berg. He was paying less for that than he was paying for a 1-room apartment in Bloomington, Indiana, where we went to school. So that was insane. But then I also noticed from figures reading about this, the source on this one was Immowelt, the German website, that basically, well, I looked at this and I looked at a study from the OECD that Germany was below OECD average for advanced economies for rent burdens of people. Like it was, I want to say it's gone up though. It's gone up from about 10 or 11% of disposable income or post-tax income to about 20%, but it's still pretty low. It's like at the average, whereas obviously other countries are much worse. But obviously that's still a change, that it's gone from being below average to at the average. And Immowelt determined that in Berlin, rents since 2008 had gone up 104%.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, it has been. So you do have the stories of people then who have gotten their, who've locked into their rents. I guess I have to put this into perspective too. Like, unlike the United States, you don't really have like a lease system like you do, where you have to continuously renew it, because in that sense, your landlord then every 1 or 2 years could come back to you. Obviously depends on the state that you're in the US, but can like raise your rent according to then what market prices are of real estate is.
Yeah.
And in Germany, it works more in the sense of whatever your rent was locked into when you got the place, your rent cannot be raised more than I think 3% every year. Don't quote me on that. I think that's just what I remember reading in like my kind of like the of just me personally looking up like why. So they can like make certain amenities more expensive, but they can't make your actual rent that you pay more expensive. However, if I were to move out and then move into a similar, like into an apartment in the exact same building, then the game starts all over again.
Yeah.
So it goes into a sense of then what they're willing to then, what you're willing to pay, I guess, in terms of real estate of, what's it called? I can't think of the word, of how it adjusts to the market norms of your neighborhood,
So, and that's something that I wanted to ask, because as a person who has owned a home and is buying another home, not to landlord, but to live in, a lot of times that rents go up. One, because landlords are greedy, and as always, fuck landlords. But also, the value of a place where a house might be or an apartment might be goes up, and therefore property taxes go up. I mean, do you have that in Berlin, or is there something about Berlin that, like, because when you say cheapest city, like my American head is just like, oh, what's wrong with Berlin? And, it could just, it's like, oh, so there's rats everywhere, right? And there's cockroaches. But like, or is it just everywhere. Is it just that Berlin, like, cares so much about, like, look, that like owning property isn't the way to to get rich in Berlin because they put so many restrictions, not only on renting as we've been talking about, but also on how much a property is worth and how much. Or do are there even property taxes? Do you pay taxes on what you own in Berlin when it comes to land? Because for here it's not only where you are, but like the size of your plot, the size of the house and everything. How much of the house is livable versus like basement or attic or whatever. So is there that like on the side of the owners as well?
I honestly have no idea because I've never even thought about owning property in Germany, which is actually kind of a cool thing. Like I from growing up in the US to then coming here and that not having be a thought is actually kind of liberating because it's just a responsibility that I don't need to have. But I know that in the US too, it's also like you're kind of enticed into owning property based off of tax exemptions and stuff like that you can like qualify for once you become a property owner. And I don't think that Germany has that because that's not really like a part of the German welfare system like it is in the US.
Well, also owning a house means, I get to do what I want with it. Mm-hmm. I don't have to deal with the landlord. So owning versus renting has its ups and downs. Like I don't have to deal with the slumlord, but also like, last year when the tuck pointing failed on during a storm and water was pouring into one of my pantries, I had to find $1,500 immediately to fix that. So they each have their own way, but also I live in a very inexpensive city as well. But unlike Berlin, we are full of rats and cockroaches. St. Louis is a garbage city in its own right, but it's cheap too. Like I have just under 3,000 square feet. I have a yard. I have a 2-car garage. And my mortgage, which is my monthly payment, is under $1,000. But again, you have to deal with the turnarounds there.
Well, so one thing I would throw out there, just really quick for Francis, in Berlin, at least from the stuff that I researched reading this, it said that about 85% of people in Berlin rent instead of own.
Yeah.
And also in Germany, I know this just as like a general thing. It's a lot harder for you to like remodel or renovate a house and cause it to gain a huge amount of value. The German government, from what I understand, they're pretty strict about how the appraisal process works for housing values. And so as a result, it kind of like you can't really flip a house in Germany the way that you could in America, where you buy a beat up ass house and then you put like $30,000 of renovation in it and you've somehow doubled its value. That doesn't really happen. Like as far as I understand it, at least, and I've known this from checking prices. I mean, like Berlin has gotten way more expensive, but I mean, compared to Paris or compared to London or compared to even to Munich, it's so much cheaper.
I think Munich's the most expensive city in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. Munich or Frankfurt is. Like, I would never move to either one of those places for that reason.
I've also heard that at least Frankfurt is just like boring as hell. But one thing I'd say too is, Francis, just FYI, is that I mean Berlin also had like a big shrinkage in population right after the end of the Cold War, in a way that like New York was cheap after people like left New York in the 60s and 70s. That happened in Berlin, as far as I understand it, but it happened like in the 90s. And so as recent as like the early 2000s, it was like basically you could practically squat for free. And if I'm not mistaken, people still do that.
Yeah, not so much anymore, but it definitely was a movement that was really big during the fall of the wall. That's kind of how you have the whole techno scene that comes out into Berlin. That is very much still a part of the city, I would say. But the reason too that then it's so cheap, one part is that then I think the population after like before World War II was like 4 million people, and Berlin today is like barely at 3.5 million, and this has been climbing back up from I think around 2.5 million about a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And not to mention too that you have two cities, a city that was in two countries that then is being brought back together. And so a lot of the reason that then is so cheap is just because that half of Berlin was part of a very like what I guess like a lot of people in the West would say is like generally underdeveloped in a lot of senses in terms of like economically, just things were cheaper in the East. That's why if you go rent a house in Dresden or in Leipzig today, it's significantly cheaper than Berlin.
Yeah.
So there is like that then's tied into it. I mean, I know for like Potsdamer Platz, which is one of like the big spots to do nothing at that people go to when they come here, that immediately was bought by like Mercedes right when the wall fell down. I think the whole area is actually still owned by Daimler because it cost nothing. So there were just massive land grabs that happened. And so the squatter movement was actually a response to that. It wasn't just because like, oh, this is cool, but it was actually like a political movement to, kind of have an anti-capitalist approach to this of like, everyone should have a house. Berlin, there are way too many houses still today, and there's rising homelessness and rising unemployment in the city currently. So, yeah.
So it seems like what Berlin is going through isn't necessarily like there certainly are controls that are in that are in place, but like in 30 years or so, Berlin could be another New York City if politicians don't kind of keep a clamp down on that.
Yeah, it's always possible. I mean, like right now, I think Berlin's been lucky that one of the very few things that the Red-Red-Green coalition has done. So it's of the left, who are democratic socialists, the Social Democrats, and the Green Party are the controlling parties in Berlin, and they were the ones who passed that rent control resolution. So there have been pushes to that then of good policy. It just depends on how long that government exists here, because to be very fair, they have been very inefficient in other aspects. There's an article, hilariously enough, that in German is called, it literally translates as Berlin, the Venezuela of Germany, written by one of our favorites on the show, Jan Fleischhauer, who used to write for Spiegel, and now he writes for, I think, Focus or something, which are both kind of like right-wing magazines. And he kind of points to like, oh, look at how inefficient how inefficient Berlin is, and how you have to wait forever to, register your apartment when you move. I mean, it does suck. That is true. Like the public transit here isn't the quickest or the most reliable, but the city works. Like those aren't things that then like it's just kind of inconvenient. But these are things that just piss off like conservative politicians and conservative people in the city. But things like job security is not or rent control are things that are never going to be uttered out of their mouth, because they obviously have a role of trying to make Berlin more profitable for people like Deutsche Wohnen and stuff like that. So
it's always funny to me when like Nate in England and because in America you mention like Medicare for all or universal health care. And you will always get people who like, spit on the ground and just like, how dare you suggest somebody not need, $1 million to not die of cancer. But like when you go to countries that have had these things and have had them for a while, like the idea, like even the hard right wingers, wouldn't be as insane as to just be like, yeah, we just need to get rid of, like, I know in England they're trying to, but
yeah,
like,
in Britain's an exception though. I mean, it's definitely an exception.
I mean, that's Turf Island, the land where racism began. England is its kind of its own thing, but like generally in other places they and don't get me wrong, other countries, every country is shit in its own its own new and glorious ways, but like when I can't imagine like a hard right winger just coming out and being like, and also the rent is too fucking low. You guys, everybody's paying everybody needs to pay more money to people who own the land around here. Like that's I cannot imagine that would go over well. Now they could probably do little things like, oh, we're gonna schmooze the landlords, and in 10, 15, 20 years of doing policy changes, maybe we can do something. But like it's never going to be the forefront of a movement.
Yeah, I think the thing I think is really interesting, because it kind of correlates with yesterday. Brandenburg and Saxony had elections, and the AfD, so the Alternative for Germany, if no one knows, is like a rising far right-wing party that has kind of done that, that they've kind of like, oh, we're the party of the people, this and that. They kind of came up big with what's called like the Pegida movement, so the Patriotic Europeans for the whatever, I don't know.
Oh, he's for the Islamicization of Europe or whatever. Yeah.
So they were the party that then kind of like piggybacked on that and have been gaining more and more and more seats in Germany. And yesterday they like killed it. literally like got 25% of seats in both Brandenburg and Saxony. And that's kind of something that they've never actually really addressed all that well, is like kind of pretending to be for, populist issues, but when you start looking at their program, they're actually really like free market and neoliberal. Just they want it with like a kind of like nationalist face with it, which I think is like a pretty common trend just in Europe in general. But the only people who are really calling for like, like the poor landlords and stuff like that are your typical like center right, or like libertarian parties like the FDP in Germany, which they're both losing a lot of ground. So that I think even people who are like the people who are being attracted by the AfD and the far right know that these parties are like kind of bullshit too. They just kind of like the racism of the other one.
Yeah, of course. Well, I was thinking about this too because the thing that prompted me to start this conversation was I saw the story in the Independent about the plan for rent control in Berlin. And basically, this piece came out in June, and then the law was actually passed, as I understand it, like maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago. Where the story from the Independent, the text reads, is Berlin's government has approved a plan for a 5-year freeze on rents aimed at taming soaring housing costs in the German capital. The legislation follows huge pressure from residents angry that rent hikes are making the city, where 85% of people rent their homes, unaffordable. The city's housing senator, Katrin Lumpscher, said that the rent cap planned to take formal effect in January next year would be backdated to 18 June to prevent landlords rushing to raise rents before the proposal becomes law. So that to me is like, okay, cool. Well, I mean, hey, that's a step, and it's rent control for for a city where most people rent. But then the commentary I saw was from Politico's Europe editor, who's a guy named Matthew Karnichnig. He says in his tweet, Berlin goes full Venezuela. City's top housing official, in scare parentheses, who belonged to East German
that was
SED,
the best part of that thing.
proposes plan that would cut many rents in half and place moratorium on increases. And of course, this guy just had a multi-day meltdown after he got made fun of for this. But the point being here that here's the city that basically is saying we are trying to slow the increase of rent. There's nothing in there about social housing. There's nothing in there about combating landlords as a class. It's literally just residents are angry that their rents have been going up because of property speculation, and they're trying to slow it to a minimum. And that apparently is full Venezuela.
Exactly. Yeah. I go to the grocery store and I cannot buy toilet paper.
I fucking hate it when I have to eat cats in Germany. Shit.
Yeah.
I'd rather just eat weird floating vegetable aspic gelatin things they sell in the grocery store.
Exactly. Yes. I want to get my my blood sausage because that's a normal thing that you're supposed to eat.
So I lived in Germany as a little kid, and I moved back to America when I was almost 9 years old, and I still am grossed out to fuck by those weird aspics. Like those things are just like, I've never been in a country that loves gelatin mold things more than Germany.
You should have been in America in the 70s, because that's what everything was. Everything was something free form floating. Like you get a bundt cake pan, fill that bitch with Jell-O and slices of fruit and some hot dogs, and baby, you got a 1970s dinner right there.
Oh god,
dude, look. There's plenty of Twitter accounts that like I have cookbooks from the 70s specifically because it's just like how did we survive as a people then?
Yeah, so I Nick, I wanted to kind of bring up that commentary about both scare quotes about the guy being a former member of an East German party, like,
I'd like,
wow, big shocker.
Yeah.
But also that this is somehow Venezuela. This is full Venezuela in Matthew Karnichnig's opinion.
I need historical context. Is East Berlin good or bad?
Is East Berlin good or bad?
Good or bad? I don't want any history. I just want a black or white. Because this guy's part of a former East Berlin political party. So
East Berlin was the communist part. East Berlin was the communist part.
Okay. So good.
I mean, one of the things that they were really good at was actually housing. So, to be fair, one of the things that I kind of wish that... So I guess there's like a thing that you have to look at too in Germany that's like really weird, is that in the German constitution, they didn't know who was going to win the war, like the Cold War. So there's just like random articles that are there to like, well, if the Soviet Union takes over, then I guess that we already have these in our constitution. And one of them is like it's called Article 14. It's like the right to expropriation of property. And it's pretty cool. So that's kind of a big discussion right now. If one of the big movements here in the city is to do exactly that, to expropriate properties of landlords, in quotes, because they're not even landlords. These are massive, finance, speculation companies or whatever. One of them is literally just the real estate version of Deutsche Bank that was formed in like 2011 because they saw a market for this. And they're called Deutsche Wohnen. So German Living, which has a pretty shit name in English. And they own like hundreds of thousands of apartments in Berlin, and only for the reason of just real estate speculation. So I think I don't remember how many thousands of apartments you'd have to have control of for that if this passes. So there were petitions that then went that I think they had like 73,000 signatures that then are being reviewed by the city to then if it should become like a referendum or something like that next year or in upcoming years. So that would definitely be a massive victory if something like that would happen, because Deutsche Wohnen, first off, just should not exist, and they make it seem like that the reason that they exist is to build apartments, but they actually haven't built one.
Oh wow!
So it is, So it is just, not even just landlords being shit, but Deutsche Bank being as shit as they possibly can be, because as if that bank hasn't done enough harm in Europe to begin with.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, and clearly Matthew Karnichnik is not insane. So I assume real estate investment trusts also exist in Venezuela and are constantly buying up empty apartments in Venezuela to hoard them at a profit.
I mean, they wish they could.
I'm sure they fucking exactly. I mean, that's the thing too that gets me about this is so I wanted to talk about and get some perspective on this, because I think from the outside it'd be easy for people to look at this and be like, oh well Berlin must be this socialist paradise, when in fact it's very obvious this is like market liberalism. They're a little bit bolder about certain kinds of reforms or certain kinds of controls that have been politically unpopular basically with the center right in the last 40 years elsewhere in the world. And I bring that up because I moved to the United Kingdom from New York. And New York had a bit of a, just as the United States had the wave election in 2018, in New York's state legislature, there's a significant leftward movement. And a little bit of inside baseball with the New York legislature. Andrew Cuomo, who is basically a 90s Republican, kind of gamed the system and got Democrats from very, very safe Democratic seats to form their own independent caucus and basically not caucus with the Democrats, because that way, whenever the Democrats tried to pass legislation that Andrew Cuomo would have to defend nationally when he decides to run for president, he wouldn't have to veto it, because it would never get passed, because his independent caucus would just caucus with the Republicans. And so those people are banking on the fact that New York has 9% turnout in its legislative elections. A lot of those people got replaced, and there were a lot more left-ish candidates from actual like Democratic socialists to just kind of center left Democrats. And so New York has also put in some new, they've passed laws for rent regulation. But New York has this really, really arcane system, because you have rent control and rent stabilized. And it sounds like what Berlin is talking about is more in the line of rent stabilized. Whereas in New York, if you have a rent control apartment, they absolutely do not make any new rent control apartments. Your family, or you individually, someone in your family, or you, the person, has to have been in that apartment since 1971. The apartment has to have been built before 1947, but basically they can't raise your rent. So when you hear stories about this person has a $50 a month 3-bedroom apartment in the Lower East Side, it's because it's been in their family since the early 70s. Whereas rent stabilized are buildings that were built up until the mid 70s, and some units still get put into rent stabilization, but they have to be 6 units or fewer in buildings. Take that back. It has to be 6 units or more. And they do raise the rent. There's just controls on how much they can raise it by. But there are all sorts of different ways in which you can lose your rent stabilized lease. Like if you earn too much money, if the rent goes up, the total property value goes up past a certain point. And so they're trying to change those, and then also pass some. They also pass some citywide rent, kind of just general renters terms. And this is what passes for full Venezuela in the New York City rental market. Ready? All right, get ready.
It sounds horrible.
Oh yeah.
Oh my
I
goodness!
can't believe it.
I mean, it actually, like, to be fair, that sounds like a complete headache of all the like little nuances that you have to know of the law in order to maintain.
Oh no, it's insane, and so this is the new protection for people beyond just rent stabilized or rent regulated apartments. This is for all New Yorkers. These are the reforms. Security deposits will be limited to 1 month's rent, and procedures will be improved to make it easier to get renters to get their security deposits back. Okay, great. That's like Vegas shit. It means nothing. Tenants who were seen as troublemakers by landlords, perhaps for standing up for their rights, would sometimes end up on blacklists that could be shared among rental agencies. This practice would be banned. Okay, but unless it's like clarified very specifically, I'm sure they'll get around it. Tenants would be better protected during the eviction process, particularly against retaliatory evictions. Wow, the fact that exists and you're like, oh, it'll be better protected but not banned, tells me a lot. Unlawful evictions, such as when a landlord illegally locks out or uses force to evict a tenant, would become a crime, a misdemeanor punishable by a civil penalty of between $1,000 and $10,000 per violation. Wow, amazing that an unlawful eviction is not a crime currently. And then landlords would be required to provide 30 days notice to tenants if they intend to increase the rent by more than 5% or are not going to renew the lease, because legitimately they won't give you notice otherwise. So that's
Venezuela. All of that.
That is legitimately, people are fucking saying, oh my God, like the New York Post and this dumb shit. They're saying, oh, this is Venezuela. And it's like, what I just described to you, like, London is a fucking hellhole when it comes to renting. It's insane. But like all those things, there are protections far above and beyond that in even a city as like neoliberal waste pit as London. So the idea that's the bleeding edge of left policy is insane.
To an American, it is though. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
I heard somebody yesterday describing Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as people who are the far left. I was like, I mean, to you, yeah, but to like literally any other country, that's just normal.
Yeah, I think the thing that's that really stuck out to me, kind of in that whole thing, is that I always find it really interesting in like any like basic economics course that you take. There's always like the subject of like price ceilings and price floors and why they're bad and why they're horrible for the economy and this and that and that. And I just remember I got in a debate with one of my like economics professors because I was like, because it was about exactly this, about like, I guess, yeah, rent stabilization, not even rent control. And they used an example of Venezuela in the fucking textbook.
Oh, God.
And it was like, oh, well, you know, Hugo Chavez made a lot of apartments for people, which was good, but it brought down, like, the competitive nature of the market wasn't allowed to flourish, and the quality of these apartments went down. I'm like, that statement they can't even actually prove. They just made up shit. And all this is just in the end trying to tell me is that, like, oh, I'm so sorry that, you know, probably a multi-billion-dollar corporation can't fucking make money off of real estate speculation now in this country or in this. I think they use like New York too as like an example, but it didn't really make sense either. And but it's just funny because like in the end, if you push it enough, you just realize, like, you know, or like just that the mask eventually just comes off, that it's like, oh, this thought is just brought around entirely in economics because it's only there to make money for people then who are just doing nothing. Like, it does not work to fucking take care of a building and rent it out to people for way more money than it should be.
It's basically, it just becomes religious scriptures for landlords. Like, and I think about this too because, Francis, I figure you'd get a kick out of this. As I was looking through the story about the New York rent control law, that Andrew Cuomo, kind of realizing that things have shifted, at least agreed that he would sign it. I found an editorial in a admittedly right-wing sort of Breitbart clone kind of thing, but posing to be like an intellectual standard bearer, called The Daily Signal. And this is the headline: New York City's rent control laws erase property rights and worsen housing supply. The authors' names, by the way, are funny. They are Amy Swearer and Giancarlo Canaparo. So the Guido contingent is respected and given room to talk. So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs so you guys can get a laugh. Owning property means more than having your name on a deed. Lawyers and judges often refer to property ownership as a bundle of rights because with ownership comes more than just the mere right of possession. You also have the right to use, modify, dispose of, and exclude others from your property. You don't need a law degree to appreciate any of that. Every child with a favorite toy understands the idea, and any grade school student who's had a civics class knows why property rights are so important. As Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story once put it, in a free government, almost all other rights would become worthless if the government possessed power over the private fortune of every citizen. Just think of Venezuela, a country whose constitution guarantees a litany of high-minded rights such as free speech, but where the government's monopoly over property rights allows it to buy the votes of its starving people with food handouts. So I had to stop there because I was going to lose my mind, because I was like, oh my God, wow, New York City, full Venezuela.
If only you had taken Economics 101 while you're in your liberal colleges. You'd learn the thing about how money works.
And so that's the thing that gets me about it, and I want to talk about this kind of like just an open discussion, is that 2 points. Number one, anything that impinges the sort of the right of landlords to do whatever the fuck they want, to be the most, just to suck the vital lifeblood off of literally every fucking human being by just extorting money from them. Anything that impinges that in any capacity or just makes things slightly more even-handed is going to get called full Venezuela. It doesn't matter what it is. Like whether it's in Sweden, whether it's in America, whether it's in Germany, or whether it's in literally Venezuela. It's all full Venezuela.
I'm going to start. Here's going to be my new brand on Twitter: is replying to every Republican representative or senators like, wow, you're really going full Venezuela, because it fucking means nothing anymore. It literally doesn't mean anything. Like, if you want to talk about like a government that is cracking down on its people and has no problem like beating the shit out of its citizens, it's like literally any protest that happens in America, full fucking Venezuela. Giving $1 to a homeless guy, that's Venezuela. Painting your porch, fucking, you're doing a Venezuela all over the place. Why? I don't know. Because it's scary. Because it's scary and I don't like you, and it's Venezuela. It's Venezuela all over this fucking place.
I guess because like I'm slightly removed from that. I mean, the only exposure that I have to that really is just like seeing interactions of people on Twitter just like dunking on these idiots. Mm-hmm. But because in Berlin, I think that there's it's kind of it is harder to do that argument because of people like, I think, a living memory of the GDR. And a lot of people, although they may have lived in it and maybe have problems with it was authoritarian, it was this, it was that. One of the things that they genuinely will admit is that I had a job and I had a job in housing security. Like, you wouldn't be kicked out of your house unless maybe if the Stasi came after you and stuff like that. But the reality of it is that it was pretty affordable for basic necessities. You had a house that your rent was not determined by the market, and you had a job. It may not have been the greatest job in in all of Germany, but nonetheless you were bringing home money every week or every other week or whatever. And
it sounds like fucking Venezuela to me, Nick.
Probably is. I don't know, but it really I think it genuinely is just harder to come around that argument from just random people, because in the US you kind of have that boomer mentality of socialism, anything that I don't like is socialism, therefore it's bad, therefore it's scary, so on and so forth. But here, I don't know. I don't see that as often from boomers. I just kind of see that in op-eds, and they're never good arguments. And you just scroll down to the bottom and who is this person? Oh, their dad is just the head of a financial trust or something like that. It's always really obvious.
It was like that Politico editor. When I argued with him, I was like, serious question, making fun of him. I was like, dude, do you really think that if you look at a place like Dublin or a place like London, that you could say, oh yeah, this rental market is sustainable? In a place where London, they've gotten past the point where they realize that because of property prices and values and land costs, that there's no way that people on normal wages are able to, not enough people can afford to buy a new home or a new flat on current wages. And so whereas it used to be, okay, well, the government has this help to buy scheme, they realize that now, even then, it's not profitable for them. They can't charge the kind of prices that they want, because to buy a 1 or a 2 bedroom flat is going to cost more than the limit on help to buy, which is £500,000, which is $650,000. So instead, what they've done is they've had this new thing called shared ownership, where I'm not kidding, they're like, oh, you can buy your own place on shared ownership, which means you own half the deed and the investor owns the other half of the deed, because they want to hoover up that excess equity, but they realize that you could never afford the mortgage on your own.
Y'all managed to make a dumber fucking timeshare.
Yeah, basically, it's a timeshare where you own half your flat and the other half is owned by like BlackRock or something.
Oh hell yeah, that sounds like a cool name. Very, not I don't know. Never mind. This in Ireland though, right?
No, this is in London.
Oh, okay. Because I was gonna say like
in Ireland, the problem I think is more that because Ireland's a tax haven, and there hasn't been as much social housing built in Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as there was in the UK during the same like post-war period. So many tech and finance companies have moved to Ireland, and so they pay, and oftentimes like for the really like high-end shit, they literally just pay the rent of the people, like their salaried employees. And so it's hard to get like what you'll hear stories of, like I've even looked at it, where a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom flat is like anywhere from 1,800 to 3,000 euros a month. So it's insane. Like Ireland didn't start out as bad as London, but it's obviously getting worse. But when I brought that up to that Matthew Karnichnik guy, his response was to give me a graph that like wasn't fucking labeled and just be like, well, this graph says that wages and housing prices continue to climb. They said it was unsustainable in the 90s when I lived in London, so it's fine. And it's like, yes, because nothing's changed since then, has it, Matthew? And I realize like none of this is meant to be a winning argument. It's just like to express landlord outrage and have it be signal boosted by other landlords.
Well, I was just thinking about like the sense with Ireland. I thought that was a hilarious example then that's given because one of our co-hosts, Kieran, is from Cork, but he lived in Dublin for a while and moved to Berlin because Ireland is impossible to live in. Like everything has become so privatized that you cannot afford to live there. And one of the brand new thing that they're doing, by the way, Ireland learned nothing after the financial crisis, is that they're having all these like American style shopping centers come and be built, which are obviously driving up property values of places like in the middle of nowhere. But they're going to be abandoned in 3 years because if this, recession that's like looming over us like does come, one of the first places to be hit again will be Ireland. And cool. But all that for, a very, quick money grab by whoever then is consulting for the Irish government.
Everybody deserves to have an outlet mall to get cheap Nikes and we have outlet malls all over the place here. People fucking travel for them, all right? So they're pretty nice sometimes. So enjoy them until they, like you said, they all destroy themselves.
One of my wife's friends is like a front-end developer for a tech company, but he doesn't live in Dublin. He lives in Dundalk, like closer to the Northern Irish border. And the reason is it's too fucking expensive. He and his wife can't afford a place, even on like a tech developer salary in Dublin. Like their money goes so much further, but then he has to commute. Like, I don't know how fucking far that is, but like it's probably a decent like 45 minutes one way. And, I just look at this stuff and I say, if this is sustainable to you, like that's because you're of the class of people that hasn't been affected by it. But it's like, you find yourself in this situation where people basically from these like landed classes or like landlord classes want to tell you that like, no, you're wrong. Disbelieve what you see with your own eyes and what you and your friends' experiences are. This graph that I haven't bothered to label is telling you that everything is fine. And I mean, that legitimately happened to me.
Oh yeah,
That's what this fucking guy's response was.
I was definitely like keeping an eye on that whole interaction because I could not believe just the just genuine stupidity that this guy like just kept feeding you.
And that's a senior editor at a fucking big American like journalism outlet. Like it just blows my mind. And I think about the reason why I brought up the military too is that like when I think about like all of the kind of social welfare benefits that the military uses to like recruit people and also to retain them, especially once they have families, you realize that somewhere they've been like, wow, America's system of just like you're utterly, at the whims of the market, and healthcare can ruin you and your family's lives in any moment, or rent can become such a burden that you literally are going to you'll either be starving or homeless. And they were like, oh yeah, that's bullshit. We don't want. That shouldn't apply to soldiers. Like that's too much of a hassle for us to be dealing with. And so they created a workaround. And it's not necessarily, I'm not happy with giving people vouchers for fucking landlords, but also like I would say it makes more sense to give people cash than it does to be like, oh, you have to have this housing voucher that can only go to like a private landlord kind of thing. Because ultimately, like, I mean, not get too much in the weeds on this, but at least it's giving people more spending cash. But I guess I look at it that it's like, people, even in an institution as conservative as like the fucking U.S. military, can look at this and say, oh yeah, this is bad. We shouldn't have this. We need a workaround. But then everybody else, when you try to say, hey, maybe not just people who sign up for like fucking, Imperial Guard, but actually like normal human beings in our society, maybe they should have those protections too. And it's like, no, you're Nicolas Maduro. We've already replaced you on Twitter. We took away your verification, gave it to Juan Guaido. Guess what? That's a socialism. That's communism. You're not allowed to do it.
Yeah, it going back to the argument that I had earlier, like try to argue with like most soldiers are so like insanely right wing and anti-socialism, anti giving anything to anybody, and you say, well, look, man, then we should take away basic BAH, which is basic allowance for housing. And it's like, whoa, well, that's my money. It's like, see, you're stuck on this now. Because now you're just like, oh, I need this money for to pay my rent. And here's the thing, like you said, Nate, you can live on post, but nobody who's married with a kid. I don't want to say nobody, but a lot of people who are married with a kid, maybe they don't want to live on post. They want to live off post. They want to find an apartment or a house off of the military base. And the fact that we do give people money for that. When I went to Iraq, they gave me upwards of $1,000 a month for where I lived. And I mean, I wrote checks to my roommate for the year that I was gone and fucking pocketed the rest of it. Nobody comes back and just like, hey, how much are you actually using of that? They're just like, here, take the money. We assume that you're, whatever's left, you go ahead and keep and do whatever, which goes back to exactly what you're saying. Just give people money, because like I will pay my rent, and I had a roommate, but I may not have. Maybe I needed all of it. Maybe I didn't. But the idea, like, try saying, well, no, we're going to take that away. Your salary should be enough. We already have soldiers that fucking go horribly into debt. So
yeah, or like on EBT. Yeah. Well, I mean, also something too I point out is that, I mean, like when I was the 2 times that I got deployed, like I kept my housing allowance and it paid for like a storage unit off base that I was keeping my stuff in. And like everything else I got to pocket. And it's like, I look at that. Whereas, when I was stationed in Korea, the overseas housing allowance, basically they only paid the landlord what the rent was. So basically, if your rent was $1,000 a month, then that's how much they paid the landlord. If it was $2,000 a month, that's how much they paid. And I can't remember what the limit was, but it's graduated by rank. But of course, what winds up happening is that landlords basically only want to rent to American service members, and they charge the full maximum they can charge. So it just becomes another giveaway to landlords. Whereas, like, if you just give people cash, obviously that's a workaround. But I bring this up not because of like military policy being the specific focus here, but just more along the lines of there are already these contradictions you can see where people say, oh yeah, this is unsustainable. But for the troops, we're like, hey, we got to make sure you don't get as badly fucked by capitalism. But then everybody else is like, no, you just don't deserve it. And that's the thing that drives me bonkers, because not only is it not self-defeating, like obviously this helps and can reduce housing shortage and reduce like, people who are in housing but are basically house poor. And also it can stop like landlords from just being the fucking dominant force in our economy. But it winds up being, subject to this weird hysteria. And that to me, I think it's just hilarious to watch this happen, and hilarious, from your perspective, Nick, how what you're describing sounds like living in, like in socialist paradise compared to America. But then people in Germany are also complaining, saying, no, it's not fair. It's not fair to landlords. This is Venezuela. And, no matter what you do, it's always the same argument.
Yeah. I guess like the one thing that I wanted to kind of just like comment on too, that I always kind of really found weird in the US, especially with like the military, is that like it's always like kind of this thing of when you talk to them, like whether it be housing, healthcare, jobs, job security, things that then people have when they're in the military, given, okay, yeah, like maybe job security is not so much that intertwined with that, but still, you get all these benefits that then people who are conservative, who are supposed to be like, free market minded, like immediately will be like, oh yeah, like, yeah, they deserve it. But then it kind of just like stops there, because it's like, oh, well, and then comes like that, like really kind of like fascist mentality of like, in order to then go and do this, whether I think like going to college is also another example that they use. You need to, do service to your country. So it's like they got, whether it be like their housing paid for, whatever, because they were serving their country. And that was always that like really just dumb way of like them internalizing that. I know I've had like, I mean, my family is really conservative and whatnot. I've tried to have this like discussion with them along those exact same lines. Like my dad was in the military and stuff like that, so he was always like, oh yeah, the military is great for this kind of stuff. I'm like, well, don't you want that for everyone? Oh no, they have to like work for it and deserve it. And I never understood that.
I have run into more useful people working at McDonald's than people in the military. Like there have been like, you know, the people at McDonald's, they give me my food during lunch when I'm hungry, and I've run into some completely fucking useless soldiers in my day who get all the same benefits. It's just because like they tick these boxes of being mentally and physically within a certain scope to join the military. And I mean, we'll even tell you right now, like just because, you know, you would think, well, you have to get through basic training. I mean, kind of like, you know, you don't really have to like pass all of the tests. Like apparently they push you through, you know, the drill sergeants will sometimes just be like, you got close enough to the amount of shots that you needed to get, or you almost passed the run. So that's good enough. So I have run like the idea of what one deserves and what one doesn't based on like, well, you're in the military. It's like, trust me, every day that I'm on duty, like now on my reserve weekends, I am looking for ways to not work and still get paid the same amount of money. Always. Well, and when I'm on active duty, it was always the same thing. How can I do the least amount of work and still make the same amount of money or more money in some way, shape, or form? And I'm sorry, that's just you know, being an American. That's just the American
humans
way.
Yeah, I mean, fuck it. Well, I was gonna say, you know, to close these things out, I guess I just wanted to say, Nick, thank you for taking time to be on the show. And I wanted to give you a chance to shout out your podcast, since now that folks have heard you on this, they might be interested in socialism German style, but in English. So where can they find that?
Yeah, so this may be kind of hard because we weren't thinking about this when we made our name, but it is you can listen to my show, Corner Späti. So that's corner spelt in English, and then Späti, which is SP, and then A with the 2 dots, TI. However, our Twitter is with the AE instead of the A with the 2 dots because, yeah, like I said, we didn't think it over.
German orthography, a famous thing for an American tech site.
Yeah, exactly. But so you can
we'll
find
have a link in the show notes for those of you who are spelling disinclined.
Yeah, it's not my fault that then like literally we were thinking of the name for the show. I went downstairs to go grab a couple of beers, and that just happened to be the name of the kiosk that I lived at, like I lived above at the time. So I thought, hey, like that's a name. Did not think about when I was putting it in that then Americans or anyone who does not live in a German speaking country is like, yeah, I can't find this.
I imagine at least half of podcasts out there, ours included, kind of wish you could go back and rename it something else.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. We're branded now.
Yeah. So on just a last note. Yeah. So we try to cover, Europe, politics, culture, whatever it is, in English. So a lot of the times Germany because we all live here, but yeah, from a left wing perspective. So yeah, I think we're cool.
What's your Twitter account, or do you just use the podcast one?
No, mine is at Stanborg Poppy. Again, I know, like I never think of these things.
We'll link to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will follow you as soon as this comes out and it's linked, and I don't have to try to.
Hell yeah.
Spell Stanborg Poppy.
Stanborg Poppy. So I have to explain that because I think it's really funny. So Stanborg is the cheapest, shittiest beer that you can get in Berlin. It is a classic. You can get it at a kiosk for like 60 cents. And yeah, I just liked Drake's name on Instagram, so I made it that
way. Well, thank you so much. So what I want to do now is just, for those of you listening back and you regular Hell of a Way fans, just want to give you a preview of some of our bonus content. So we do a bonus episode for our Patreon subscribers once per week. And this week's bonus is Francis and I answered your questions. You write in questions, we give you answers. And so I'm going to roll a little bit of that so you can get an idea of what you would be paying for and what great content is available. Plus all the previous months, years even, of bonus content since we've been doing this. So take a listen now. All right, so the next question, how do you start the process of unfucking a family member's far right ideology that they picked up while enlisted now that they're out? It's been a couple of years and it's only getting worse, I think. So go ahead.
Well, I just want to say we've gotten a lot of questions regarding, something like this, whether it be, a brother or sister, family member, father or whatever, who like just slowly turns into, a far right QAnon-esque person, or at least starts, in that progression. And I gotta say, like, I think about like when I have bad habits, right? And that you want to get out of those bad habits. What do? You got to, find some way to fill that time. And I don't know if this is possible. I don't know if it's possible to kill somebody's YouTube habit of watching Stephen Molyneux or listening to Ben Shapiro podcasts or whatever. But I don't. There are going to be some people who are going to be more receptive than others. Like if you sit there and be like, oh, Ben Shapiro said this thing that's incorrect, and he's lying about this thing, and they just look at you and yell fake news. I don't know if there is hope there.
I don't either, and but I will say that I know a fan of the show who's a former soldier of mine, and I want to get him on here at some point to talk about this because he did go from angry online veteran to being extremely left and extremely critical of the bullshit that the right is constantly peddling. But I think that, and not to put words in his mouth, but I think that a lot of that also came as a result of him sort of coming face to face with like the shitness of what it means to be a working person, kind of atomized, alone in America, post-military service, and he realized how stacked the deck is against working people, and that changed his views a lot. And I think that the regular feed episode that I did this week with my friend Rhett Evans, who mentioned that he was like a Ben Shapiro style college conservative, and that getting stationed in Germany and seeing a functioning social democracy really changed his mind and made him realize that a lot of the stuff he was being fed by like Ann Coulter books was bullshit. I think that it takes a realization in that person's life that they've been misled, that they're being lied to. But I think those things are very, very hard to instigate on command. I might even go so far as to say that it's impossible. There has to be a series of circumstances that take place organically in which a person has to confront something that they've seen and has to reassess it. And I'll give you an example of somebody I know who has a friend of mine back in New York is Orthodox Jewish. His father grew up in South Brooklyn, was involved in Meir Kahan's movement, which, if you don't know, is a far-right extremist Jewish settler movement in Israel and Palestine. He went and fought in the West Bank in a Kahanist militia and was like full-on eliminationist, deport all Palestinians to Jordan kind of person. He's not a lefty, but he has completely changed his position on this, and he actually does a thing in Israel like once every year or so where they do like a peace ride where it's Israeli citizens, Israeli Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens of the West Bank, etc., who at least Palestinians who have freedom of movement or the right to do this, because obviously it's completely controlled, to do like a ride across Israel from like Haifa to Dimona on bicycles. It's sort of like, cooperative peace thing. And he at least has moved to the position where he acknowledges Palestinians as citizens and people who deserve rights and people who have a similar stake in, a desire for peace and sovereignty. That's a huge fucking change. But that didn't happen organically, and that didn't happen with someone making him. And it's very hard to engineer those circumstances. And so I don't know if you can. I don't know. I mean, when you think about me, when you think about being like a kind of shit dick, conservative-ish, kind of libertarian, apolitical, but very, right-leaning young kid growing up in a segregated suburb in America to where I am now, like the things that happened were things that I had to acknowledge with my own eyes. I couldn't just make shit up and say, oh, like people couldn't confront me with facts on paper because I didn't care and I wasn't going to believe them. I had to see stuff with my own eyes and be like, wow, this is really fucked up. Why is this happening? And it was only when that took place that I started to question my own beliefs. And so I come back to this point that, like, can it happen? Yes. Can you be supportive in the process? Yes. Can you try to plant the seed? Yes, but you can't make it happen. And if anything, trying to make it happen can have the reverse effect of causing people to entrench their views even more strongly.
Yeah, you can't like confront somebody with something like that. It's not like an intervention where you all sit down and be like, "Hey, your MAGA hat collection is affecting us as a family." It does. It has to be arrived at organically, and you can help that along, but it's just a really delicate fucking process. Because I talk to people. I'm from Missouri. Like I said, I used to spend a lot of time in southern Missouri, but still St. Louis is a blue city, but like Missouri blue, where it's just like, we like the Democrats, but also we like our racism. So, the Democrats are perfect for us, really. And there's always going to be people who, like, the word socialism is a dirty word. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to talk about it. And they will immediately tell you about, the fall of the Soviet Union and, Venezuela and blah, blah, blah. But you can easily talk to a lot of people about, like, man, isn't it fucked up that, like, we have to, you go broke every week trying to, afford your medication. You can't go to the doctor, or there isn't a doctor. There isn't a hospital down here. If you need to go to the hospital, it's a 20-minute drive and you don't have a car and none of your family has a car. So what do you do other than, maybe you call an ambulance in an emergency, and then that costs a bunch of money because you don't have insurance. These are things that, are not socialism, obviously. Like, Medicare for all, universal healthcare is not socialism. That is, like, literally what a normal rich country should be doing for its people. That's the point. If we don't have, like, if you're not taking care of the roads and the people, I don't understand what the point of a government is. We might as well just go ahead and disband it if you're going to say, we don't need these things. I love what I hear from libertarians is just like, well, the point of the government is to enforce the Constitution. It's like, so the only part of the government that you agree with is like the goose stepping foot soldiers that would come and stomp all over your rights. This makes no fucking sense. If you're going to be a libertarian, be a full libertarian and just be for the destruction of the government, because you're probably going to get a lot more socialists on your side on that one too. But it's a conversation that can be had. It's a conversation that you can do, like, little small things and just be like, wow, isn't it fucked up that XYZ happens? And just kind of gauge the reaction. Like, if you honestly have, like, a brother or an uncle who's just like, no, people should have, $1 million worth of medical debt because they got cancer. I don't know what you tell that person. Like, I don't know, other than, like, they should, get a job. They should do this. They should get these things. Like, look, man, sometimes even if you get a job with health insurance, it takes 90 days for you to be on the health insurance rolls. Like, they want to make sure that you're going to stick around. You're not there just to get some free cancer treatment or whatever. If you have people that honestly believe that believe this, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of conservatism, and everybody should pay through the nose for, even small misfortunes that befall them. I don't know. I don't know about how that one works, other than maybe you can be like, hey, look, man, kids with cancer, die because they don't have medical insurance. Maybe that'll pull on some heartstrings. I don't know. But,
they don't like kids either, though. Like, their point is just like, fuck them. Their parents are irresponsible. I mean, and then when their son Brayson gets a felony conviction for carfentanil or something like that, then they want to plead, oh, he's a good kid, he deserves a second chance, kind of shit. Like, it's the same. You don't really achieve anything by pointing out how hypocritical it is. I think the best thing you can do is just acknowledge that there's no point in taking it seriously, because it's completely incoherent. It's just self-serving and allowing them to both be superior and the victim at all times.
Yeah, what needs to happen is their son Brayson needs to come down with cancer. Not like a really deadly cancer, just like a little touch cancer. And then for them to get that first bill, be like, oh, Brayson's good, but also you owe us $5,000
I don't know,
because it was
man.
out
I
of
know
network.
people that have had that happen to them and their families, and then they're like, yeah, it's really fucked up. Oh, by the way, but the government spends all this money on black people and gives them free everything, and they do the knockout game. Like, it's bullshit. Like, they don't learn shit from it. Like, they really don't. Like, the government can abuse people to the point of literally, like, the kind of shit that would get them sent to The Hague in a fucking sane country, and they'll still find a way to blame poor people and black people for it. Like, it's just, they have to have that moment to themselves. They have to realize it themselves, and some people just won't, because every fucking atom of America, from the founding onward, is built on white supremacy and built on racism and built on contempt for the weak. And so
you're not going to fix all the QAnon people.
And once again, that is available on Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes to sign up and become a patron.
Yep. And you can follow me at Army Strang, follow Nate at In These Deserts, follow us on the YouTubes. I do a weekly, as often as I can, a weekly state of the pod and just talking about news, politics, whatever. You can follow us on Facebook as well. Jump onto the Patreon. We have the different tiers. We should, by this time, you're too late for the second zine. That's all right, because there's going to be another one coming out December-ish or so. So we will be releasing that out as well. So Nate and Nick, thank you. Nate, I know we don't do outro music, but if there's like a German language version of 525,600 minutes from the musical Rent, please put that in here. Or if not, just put me describing that in there, and we'll just call that good.
We do actually do outro music, Francis. You just haven't listened to the end of an episode in 3 years.
I don't. Holy shit!
No worries, man.
This is good. I'm learning things about my own podcast. I'm part of the podcast. Why would I listen to it? I always turn it off before we get to this part.
It can just be me saying the word 525,600 minutes in German, but like not to any melody and just very cold and somber.
That in its way would be
That's
German music.
German. Yeah, just like industrial sounds behind it, and you have a song.
Some EDM music. We'll turn it into some sort of like vaporwave kind of musical.
No, there already probably exists like a Kraftwerk song that is exactly that.
I'll go outside directly after this and get on the roof of my garage and just throw a bunch of garbage cans onto the street and record that and be like, all right, here it is. We've got German music. We're ready to go.
Yeah. That's what's going to be playing outside the club you can't get into when Sven doesn't let you in. So it's just the way that it goes. All right, guys. Thank you so much again. Nick, thanks for making time for this, and we will see everyone next week.